Curtiss had set his sights on an ambitious undertaking, an Atlantic Ocean crossing. In April 1913, the publisher of the London Daily Mail had announced a prize of £35,000 for the first such flight. The following winter, Curtiss secured financial backing from Rodman Wanamaker, a wealthy American businessman. Wanamaker hoped that the project would show the world that the aeroplane's potential as an instrument of peace between nations. However, the US Navy also had interest in the undertaking. The military value of a water-based aircraft able to cross oceans was obvious. Development and testing of the new flying boat known as the Transatlantic Flyer went quickly during the spring of 1914. With a wingspan of 24 meters and a length of 10, it was one of the largest planes yet built. The cockpit was fully enclosed, offering the two pilots protection from the elements. Navigation instruments included a compass and sextant, and messages from the aircraft were to be sent by carrier pigeons. Two pilots had been chosen to make this historic flight: John Cyril Port, a retired lieutenant of the Royal Navy, and Lieutenant John Towers of the US Navy. Unfortunately, Towers was ordered to report for duty aboard the USS Birmingham in April. With Towers' availability for the flight in doubt, George Hallett was chosen to replace him. Hallett, a Curtiss mechanic and pilot, later became famous as an engine expert. The plane was christened America on June the 22nd, 1914, and first flown the next day. It handled well in the air, but when fully loaded with fuel and equipment required for an extended trip, could not lift off from the water. Efforts were made to increase power and fuel efficiency through July, when the entire endeavor came to a halt. World War I erupted in Europe, and any attempt at transatlantic flight would have to be put off until the hostilities came to an end. With encouragement from John Port, the Royal Naval Air Service purchased the two transatlantic flyers. Curtiss built 62 more of these planes, designated H-4s, for the British. The H-4's performance was less than satisfactory in combat, and their hulls were unable to withstand the extreme stress of wartime service. They were used for training purposes, and to a lesser extent, as patrol planes. The outbreak of war spurred flying boat evolution to proceed rapidly. By 1917, Curtiss H-12s were in operation in Europe. These planes performed well in combat, especially anti-submarine warfare, and were credited with the destruction of numerous U-boats. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the Navy's air arm was unprepared. Even with private companies working at full capacity on military contracts, the need for naval aircraft could not be met quickly enough. A naval aircraft factory was built at Philadelphia and was producing H-16 flying boats by early 1918. The Curtiss Flying School began training Navy crews, and the Navy's own training programs were expanded. At the same time, Curtiss was developing another type of flying boat, the HS series. This single-engine aircraft was somewhat smaller than the H-12s and the H-16s, and was produced by other manufacturers under Navy contract, as well as by Curtiss. All three of these planes were purchased in great quantities by Allied governments and were highly regarded for their solid construction and dependability. The first US Navy airmen arrived in Europe in June 1917 and were soon operating from France, England, and Italy. But due to the shortage of American-built aircraft, they were obliged to make use of planes bought from other Allied countries. It was almost a year before these flyers received their first Curtiss HS-type flying boats. Meanwhile, agreements were being made to allow US Navy bases to be built on foreign soil. The Naval Aircraft Factory, Curtiss and Canadian Aeroplanes Limited began building F-5L flying boats in 1918. The 5Ls were quite similar to the H-12, but featured a much stronger hull designed to survive wartime abuse. These planes were produced too late for use in World War I but they were used extensively by the Navy for many years for scouting, fleet support, and bomb and torpedo tests. During the war, 27 American naval aviation bases were constructed throughout the world and 12 in the US. America's naval air arm acquired well over 1,000 flying boats and land-based aircraft and trained more than 30,000 recruits. The American flying boat proved to be an extremely effective wartime tool. This new machine served the Allies in many roles, including coastal and open sea patrol, escort of ship convoys, and perhaps most importantly, anti-submarine operations. And yet, the most impressive achievements of these planes were still to come. Interest in creating a flying boat equal to the challenge of a transatlantic flight gained momentum during the war. Now, though, the impetus came directly from the US Navy. The idealism that had motivated Rodman Wanamaker in this same pursuit a few years earlier was overshadowed by military needs. Navy officials contacted Glenn Curtiss in September 1917, knowing his participation would be invaluable. A design was soon agreed upon, and Curtiss was contracted to build 4 planes. These aircraft were designated NC for Navy. Curtiss No. 1 through to 4, and to the Navy's frustration, were nicknamed the Nancies by the public. They were the largest aircraft built in the US at the time, measuring 23 meters long and 8 high, with a 42-meter wingspan. Powered by 4 of the newly developed Liberty engines, the Nancies were intended for a crew of 5 or 6 men. In October 1918, the NC-1 was ready for its first test flight. The large plane handled well both on water and in the air. A longer trip was made next month to the naval air stations at Washington, D.C. and Hampton Roads, Virginia. Work on the other 3 was still in progress when this latest effort to finally cross the Atlantic by air was put in jeopardy. The war's end, in November 1918, eliminated the urgency for these aircraft, and the project came to a sudden halt. But soon, the London Daily Mail Prize was offered again, and other groups of flyers began serious preparations for a transatlantic flight attempt. John Towers, one of the pilots chosen for the pre-war America flight, stepped in to help revive the NC project. He advised his Navy superiors that the remaining planes should still be completed and an Atlantic crossing made with the intention of demonstrating American air superiority. Towers' recommendation was favorably received, and he himself was put in charge of the project. Work on the NCs then continued throughout the spring of 1919. Final preparations on the Nancy planes were carried out at a feverish pace and completed early in May. During this process, both the NC-1 and NC-4 were damaged. The NC-2 was dismantled for parts to repair these 2 planes, leaving only 3 of the aircraft to attempt the trek. On the way to the starting point, the NC-4 encountered engine trouble and was forced to land at sea. Repairs were made, and the plane arrived in Newfoundland on May 15th. The next day, the weather appeared favorable, and the 3 Nancies departed just after 6 o'clock that evening. The most promising course for the historic flight consisted of 3 main sections. At first, from Newfoundland to the Azores would be the greatest challenge at approximately 1,900 kilometers. The Nancies would next stop at the coast of Portugal, and from there continue north to Plymouth. To aid in navigation and provide help in case of a forced landing on the open sea, Navy ships were stationed every 80 kilometers along the route and would fire flares into the sky until the planes were sighted. As the aircraft passed over, each ship was to indicate surface wind direction with a searchlight and radio ahead to the next in line. As a result of speed differences between the planes, the pilots had trouble maintaining formation. After 2 near collisions in the dark, they separated during the night. In the morning, bad weather made navigation impossible. NC-1 and NC-3 landed in rough seas to try to determine their positions. Both were damaged and were unable to take off again. The crew of NC-1 was picked up 7 hours later, and NC-3 drifted for 2 days towards the Azores, finally taxiing into Ponta Delgada under its own power. The crew of the NC-4 opted to climb above the weather instead, navigating by dead reckoning. They managed to spot land through a break in the clouds and descended, flying just over the water. A safe landing was made at the Azores just before noon on the 17th of May, 1919. The remaining sections of the journey to Lisbon and Plymouth were completed without trouble. The long-dreamt goal of transatlantic flight had become a reality, and the future held great promise for the American flying boat. After their strong performance in World War I, flying boats were expected by Navy planners to play a large role in future operations. The F-5Ls, which had been produced just as the war was ending, now replaced the older Curtiss H-16s. In 1921, F-5Ls joined land-based Army planes in bombing exercises using captured German vessels as targets. It was becoming clear now that in the future, even battles fought at sea could be decided by air power. The new PN-9 flying boat made its debut in 1925, an all-aluminium hull making it both lighter and more seaworthy than its predecessors. In September 1925, a Navy PN-9 fell short in an attempt to fly non-stop from San Francisco to Hawaii, but not before setting a new endurance record of over 2,800 kilometers without refueling. Within a decade, such journeys would be made regularly. Despite the continuing growth of military and commercial aviation, the post-war years were difficult for some aircraft manufacturers. Military surplus planes were available to business and private owners at reasonable prices. But by meeting the new commercial demand for large, long-range planes, companies such as Sikorsky, Boeing, and Martin not only prospered, but created some of the most famous aircraft ever flown. In the late 1920s, Pan American Airways was fast on its way to becoming the dominant force in commercial air service. Having established routes through Central and South America, Pan Am's visionary leader, Juan Trippe, set his sights on expanding his company's long-distance passenger service. Trippe wisely hired legendary flyer Charles Lindbergh to make survey flights of new routes, thereby not only ensuring a job well done, but also gaining a great deal of publicity. Trippe required large planes, able to carry more passengers in greater comfort than ever before. Flying boats would be ideally suited for this task, since they didn't require expensive facilities on the ground. The Sikorsky S-38 was the first type of flying boat used by Pan American. This was a successful aircraft, but its range of approximately 900 kilometers with 9 passengers aboard was not adequate for Trippe's grand plans for the future. Soon, Pan Am acquired 14 consorts as part of the purchase of a rival airline. The Commodores and the new Sikorsky S-40s had a greater range and capacity than the S-38, but their real gains were made in passenger accommodations. The luxurious cabins set a new standard for air travel, which subsequent flying boats operated by Pan Am would meet or exceed. Pan Am received the first of 10 Sikorsky S-42 flying boats in 1934, followed by 3 Martin M130s over the next 2 years. These huge seaplanes, known as Clippers, quickly came to embody the romance of flight and the excitement of travel to exotic locations.